Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for standing by. Welcome to today's web seminar. If you are experiencing technical difficulties joining the WebEx session, please dial 1-866-229-3239, or you can email technical questions to support@webex.com. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. We are using audio broadcasting for today's event. You may have noticed a small dialog box in the upper left corner of your screen. This box must remain open to hear audio. It can be moved if it is obstructing your view. To ask a question at any time, please feel free to do so by clicking on the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Questions will be addressed at the conclusion of today's presentation. Your moderator for today is Martin Rybro. Martin, you now have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Yael. Well, hello to everybody. Welcome to this webcast from IBS. It's been interesting to see the level of interest in this topic that we're looking at today, and so I'm aware that we've got people who's I should be saying good morning to, good afternoon, and good evening. Over the next half hour, we're going to look at this often neglected aspect of core banking system projects, the contract negotiation side. A couple of things I should point out from a housekeeping point of view. Firstly, if at any point of time you want to ask a question, you can do so through the Q&A panel. What we're going to do is we will be answering questions offline after the presentation, but by all means send us questions as we go along. Secondly, at the end, this presentation will be available on the website. It will be recorded, so you can go back in at your leisure and listen to it then. So without further ado, let me just explain very briefly why we thought we would look at this area now. Basically, as most people will know, IBS has been focused purely on the core banking systems market for the last 20 years. That has been with our editorial hat on, with the IBS Journal and with the reports that we have got, and then also increasingly on the consultancy side, particularly with system selections. And it's fairly clear that on too many occasions, the contract negotiation side of the picture is ignored, or else it is delegated, and there is a disconnect between the contracts and the project as a whole. And this clearly has a number of dangers, and not least because, as we know too well, these big, complex, expensive, risky projects do have a tendency, far too often, to not go as planned, shall we say. So, along with my fellow presenter today, Nick Brewer, who will be doing the bulk of the presentation, we thought that this was an area where there would be value to drill down into. There was just one instance of this that cropped up quite recently that reminded me of the extent to which contracts often get put on a shelf and then forgotten about, and that was with a bank in the UK that had a 10-year license for its core banking system. Now, as often happens within those 10 years, there's change of personnel within the bank. The people that made the initial selection go, you get new people in. And so it was completely news to that bank when the vendor in question knocked on the door and said, your license is due to expire in a year's time. That put that bank in a particularly difficult position because the vendor was then very aggressive with the renewal negotiations, and it actually forced that bank into a very short, rushed selection process. So it's just one example of where contracts can't go and gather dust. They need to have a life cycle, and they need to be nurtured and looked after. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our main presenter, Nick, who can also briefly introduce Negotius. Nick.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, as Martin said, my name is Nick Brewer, and I'm representing Negotius on this call, this webinar. We're a very small consultancy company which specializes in helping banks make better contracts with their strategic suppliers. I don't intend to talk about us too much during the call, but hopefully that gives a background to why it is that we have the bulk of the content. During the rest of this call, what I would like to do is to run through a very brief agenda. So to help illustrate some of the problems and challenges, we've made an invented situation which hopefully captures some of the things which will ring a bell with people who've been through this process. And then we'll have a look at different negotiating approaches that banks and their advisors can take and have taken, and have a look then at what we believe are the fundamental building blocks of a better approach. As we run through this, I would like to stress, and I realize I'm the third person to say this in 5 minutes, that we do welcome questions, and if you fill them in the Q&A panel on your screen, we will come back to you privately afterwards, because we realize that you may not wish to share publicly the question or the answer with everybody else on the call. So let's step forwards and have a look perhaps at an example situation which might happen. If we set the scene first of all, you can imagine a place in which a bank has started a selection, in this case for a new core banking system, and it's a long way through the process. So all of the pieces of work which banks tend to think of as the large items, the difficult and expensive items, have been accomplished. There have been RFIs and RFPs, there have been long lists of vendors, it's gone down to short lists, the selection and the vote has been taken, and preferred and second choice vendors have been selected and indeed told who they are. At this point in the process, as is fairly normal, legal counsel has been engaged. It may be internal to the bank or external legal counsel to help with the contracting process. And so right now, we're at the place where the bank has started to negotiate contracts with the vendors. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of that bank. If I were the business sponsor or delivery manager or somebody with material interest in the outcome of the project in the bank, I might perhaps have a couple of worries. So the first worry I might have, and perhaps the most obvious one, is that although it seems quite clear what I need to achieve, is it necessarily going to be the case that the vendor will actually deliver the project on time? Now, I very purposefully use this language because that's often how banks see it. I think perhaps a more useful way to look at it is, will everybody involved in the project deliver it on time? And the reasons often I worry about this is the projects are long and complex and there's a lot of risk. And it seems fairly standard in the industry that a project could perhaps have a 6-month delay. So if you looked at a project which was all in all 5 years in duration, starting a year ago from now when the bank first decides that it might need a new core system, a year of selection, and then 2 or 3 years of implementation and testing, and then 1 year of steady state run, a core banking selection project will often perhaps assume it has a payback somewhere in the 4th year. If there was a 6-month delay caused by anything in that project, as an example, that normally leads to something like a 20% cost overrun because services continue to be engaged externally for longer. And if you look at the example at the bottom, that's obviously fairly catastrophic. So at one level, I would simply be worried by delay. Delay could cause me to go way past my payback time and have a broken return on investment case. I might also, though, when I look outside of the project itself, begin to think that there are some more worrying things. And they're more worrying than that because they're unknown. So if we picked a fairly topical and timely example at the moment, as a banker, I might have heard rumours and discussion, or indeed have been involved in formal discussions on this subject with my regulator, which suggests that there are going to be changes to how capital is allocated against credit risk. So that seems perhaps perfectly sensible and timely. The trouble is that nobody knows, because it's unknown, when the regulations will change, how they will work, and therefore what data will be needed from my core banking system to supply that. So it means that at some point in the next 2 years, I'm going to have most likely a gap against my current requirements and against my contract. But by definition at the moment, I have no idea whether that is a large gap or a small gap, what the scope of the changes or what the impact is. So this is very much one of those unknown unknowns. I know something's going to happen, but I don't actually know what or its impact. So if I were the banker at the moment, I would be feeling worried perhaps about those 2 points and perhaps others. But behind the scenes, whilst I'm sitting at home on a weekend worrying about this, the world of course continues to move forwards. A project team has been established. I've got my program director and project manager from the bank. The vendor's done the same. Maybe I have a system integrator or external consultant. Everybody's been given the instruction that failure is not an option. And the project team, and particularly its management, is told that they will be completely focused on precisely delivering what's been agreed, on time, on budget, and on scope. So as is fairly typical in these situations, I will, as I enter the negotiations, final negotiations now, be instructing my negotiating team that I would like the tightest possible contract. I would like everybody to be very clear about what needs to be delivered, and I would like there to be no room for manoeuvre or slippage, and by doing this, I would like to reduce the possibility of risk or business case challenge. Of course, as I think this, I may also be aware that no room for manoeuvre also means there's no room for manoeuvre by my employer, the bank, or indeed in the market or the regulatory environment. But if I look at this situation in this way, there are perhaps a series of questions that I should ask myself. This delivery focus, failure is not an option, precise delivery of contract, how are all of these activities and all the project plans and measurement tools which are being put into place, how are these activities linked to the original business case? Because 12 months ago, in this particular example, I sat down and decided that I had a business problem. Maybe I couldn't gain new customers, maybe I couldn't enter a new market, maybe reporting was taking me too long. So nothing that I've just spoken about really refers back to them. And then, of course, the last year hasn't just been me asking vendors to say what they can do. During my year of discussion with suppliers, I've learned things. I've understood that there are things I should have taken into account, there are alternative approaches, and that the discussions with the preferred vendor, there have been various trade-offs and compromises. I've said that in order to get a particular thing on time, I'm prepared to deprioritize something else perhaps. So this approach doesn't seem to reflect that. And finally, and if I look at my regulatory worry, this approach doesn't allow me to change my goals and the rules of the engagement for the next 3 years. And that's potentially quite risky, because the world doesn't usually stand still for 3 years, and there are things outside of my control and the vendor's control which might change. So, given this situation, what kind of approaches might I take to how my contracts would work? Well, there are 3 which we negotiators have seen in quite common use in the world. The first answer to how can I address these problems is actually one which, worryingly, we see quite a lot, and that's the answer of hope. I could just hope that nothing unexpected will happen for the next 3 years. There will be no changes in regulatory approach. My competitor banks won't bring out any new products at all. The market won't change. The vendor will continue with the same product in the same ownership, with the same strategy, and technology won't change in the slightest. So, for example, mobile technology won't move. I hope that everybody on the call can see that this is quite a flawed approach, but if you are in the situation of beginning to negotiate contracts in the foreseeable future, it's worth holding this example in mind to make sure that you don't accidentally do it, because it's not really hope, it's actually not looking at the risk. The next approach, which is quite common, is to understand that risk lies in the undefined areas of the world, and therefore I will define everything. I will fix very precisely what the vendor must deliver, and because I decided I don't trust vendors, or in fact anybody else, because it's a contracting process, and in some sense contracts can be built around that, I'm going to say that any failure to deliver becomes a potential contract breach. So, in my British English vernacular, I'd say that'll show the vendor. That'll teach them who's boss. I'll have penalty clauses in the contract, and I will have no room for anybody to escape. The challenge, of course, with this is that you will end up in court, because it's inconceivable in 3 years that there will be no change, and it's highly unlikely that you and the vendor and your advisors have understood every possible scenario or dimension to what is a very complicated problem you're trying to solve. So this guarantees that you either end up in pre-litigation negotiation, in which case your legal fees will start to be incurred again, or you end up in court. And of course, under either of those situations, in some sense, the project's failed. Interestingly, of course, the project hasn't failed because the project went wrong. It's failed because the contract described a situation which can't actually exist. And again, I'd stress from our experience, this is actually quite a common approach. A third one that we see is what I've described as pushing the vendor until they squeal. So simply reduce the price. Every time there's a price discussion, say that you have that extra thing for free, ask for credits, reduce the cash payments, stage the cash payments later, and push it to the point at which the vendor threatens to withdraw from a negotiation because it's no longer commercially viable for them. You then add strict service level agreement clauses in the contract which will regulate the vendor's behaviour, and this enables you as a bank, so it's slightly more subtle than the previous one, to keep spare budget. So if you had a budget of $12 million, maybe you've got $2 million left, which is not in the contract, and so when you get overruns or problems, you can still deliver within your budget, even if it's outside of the contract. The trouble with this isn't that you'll end up in court or litigation. The challenge is that, of course, in the same way you have business objectives, so does the vendor. And if the vendor cannot make an engagement profitable overall, it will do everything it can to achieve that goal. So you will not have the best project team, you won't be the most prioritized client, and in a subtle way, you won't matter quite so much to that vendor. If I were a bank entering into a 2-year, 3-year implementation project, I would be quite worried by that situation. I would want to matter a lot to the vendor, and so in some sense I would want the vendor to make a good and sensible business profit and return on the engagement so that we all remain focused on the same goals. So at Negotius, we would argue that these 3 approaches, which are surprisingly common in the market, probably don't serve anybody in the negotiation, selection or implementation process very well, least of all the bank. So, is there a better answer? Well, we believe that contracts are legal documents, and a good legal document will have certain features. It will restrict liability, it will say who owns what, and it will be clear, and it will be in compliance with legislation. However, we also think that contracts are business documents. Because if you do sign a contract with a vendor, maybe a 10-year term license with a 2-year implementation license and a 9-year support license, what's in that contract will actually define the chance of business success and the business outcome of a 10-year arrangement. So we think that contracts shouldn't be seen as isolated, siloed legal activities within the selection process. In fact, they need to be quite consciously linked to the bank's original objectives. They should also be open to change because, as everybody on this call must know, change will always happen and it may not be under the control of the bank. And so the contract should focus on the things which the bank wants to be delivered and needs to be delivered, leave less defined the things that don't matter, and have a mechanism for actual change. I think at this point it's interesting to look back at an actual contract in itself, and I don't know how many people on the call have seen a standard license or services or support contract, but they're actually constructed in quite a strange way. They tend to start off with 3 pages of definitions and a list of the parties involved, and then a whole series of quite standard legal terms, which are very important, to do with transfer rights, assignment, warranties, termination, liability, ownership, support, service levels. Somewhere in Addendum 6, in Schedule number 10, there will be 2 paragraphs which describe what the bank's original business objective actually is. Certainly from our work and from conversations with our legal partners, we believe it would be interesting to look at contracts the other way up and actually start out with what the bank's business objectives are and use that as the filter through which all of the rest of the contract is interpreted, either in negotiation or in pre-litigation negotiation if it comes to that, or in litigation itself. A much better outcome is to see a contract as a business document. Everything should be about the business case, and it should be possible to link the contract terms to the business requirements, and hence when the contract terms are being measured for their performance, so has the vendor and has the bank delivered what they said they would deliver, it's transparent to see how this is linked to the bank's original commercial intent. So how would you actually do this? That sounds a very good objective and goal overall, but is there a way that you could actually look to imagine how it might be possible to view the world differently? Well, there are many different ways that you could do this, but we think that it's important to see the entire process holistically. So, in the selection process normally, the information and the activities tend to be divided into silos. And this is something which banks understand very well as being problematic when they look at their repeatable processes. So if you apply for a real estate loan from a bank, it needs to have, and believes it needs to have, an end-to-end view of that process, of who the customer is, what their history is, what the use of the loan is, how the collateral works, trends in the collateral, and the performance. So it seems to make sense to apply that same end-to-end holistic view to the entire process of selecting, negotiating, contracting, and implementing a system. On this diagram here, we have a series of sort of standard stages starting from business objective setting, and to help it appear clearer what we're trying to describe here, we've got some examples beneath it. So entering a new market, choosing the fact you need to buy perhaps a CRM system, a channel tool, and a product factory, and so on. The point of this end-to-end process is that data and information only really maintains business meaning when you maintain the context of it. So understanding, for example, a vendor response without understanding what the question is and why it was asked becomes a little meaningless. So we think that using either an approach or tools or anything else which works for you, it's possible to maintain a persistent view of all of that information from end to end. The other thing that it's probably important to understand is that although this looks like a linear process where there's a start with a business objective and there's a finish with the contract and the solution being implemented, we believe strongly that in a well-run bank, it should be possible to see this as a cycle. Because the length of time within these 5 boxes on the screen in front of you now is probably somewhere between 4 to 5 years. And having implemented the solution, it probably makes sense to look again and to understand whether that now matches changed business requirements and budgets within the bank. So So this should be a background continuous activity which becomes particularly more focused when there's a material piece of change. So I'm hoping that you are all enthusiastically nodding your heads, looking at the various screens and displays in front of you at that. I'm hoping that I've made a case that it's possible to look productive in a different way. But if you went and described to colleagues or friends what we have talked about here, there are a possible series of answers you might get which we think encompass some common misconceptions. So the first one is contracts. It's just for the lawyers, right? Well, I'm hoping that from the presentation that we've had so far, you can see that in fact a good contract is not just a good legal document, but it's a good business contract. It's a good business document as well. And in fact, you cannot really divorce one of those meanings from the other. So you do need lawyers, but it's not just for the lawyers. Another statement which you might hear is, well, that was very interesting, but I've actually signed the contracts now. I've got the contracts in place, so I don't really need to think about them, do I? I think an important insight here, and what perhaps you could remind your colleague or friend is, that in fact you're still living with the contracts, and however good or bad those contracts are at the moment, they're going to undergo challenges and change. And it might be worth bearing in mind the business impact of those changes and seeing the world that way over the next few years as they develop. Perhaps the final comment, and it's certainly one that we've heard over time from various banks with whom we've engaged, is that, well, I've got all my contracts, I've put them in one place, they're in a document management system, so I can refer to them whenever I want to. Everything's fine, so clearly I don't need to do anything. Again, I would answer that same statement with the idea that just having the contracts recorded doesn't help you understand the context of why they were created, what the purpose and original meaning of them was, and therefore being able to measure how they work, how they're serving you as a business. I think if I wanted to look overall at a summary perhaps of what we've been talking about in this session, is there are probably really four things. The first one is that once you have a contract or series of contracts in place, this will define how you as a bank interact with your strategic IT suppliers, partners, consultants, and other entities in your IT ecosystem on an ongoing basis. These are important tactical, commercial, and strategic documents. They're business documents. And so contracts probably deserve to have a lot more attention than just being left to the lawyers. Contracts in themselves are created out of a very long, complex series of interactions between the bank and its suppliers. And if you lose that context, if you lose the understanding of those interactions and why they happened and what the conclusions and compromises were within them, in some sense the contract becomes meaningless. It becomes legally enforceable, but nobody really understands the content of it. And I think Martin's example of the introduction of a bank which had actually lost sight of the fact that its core banking system had a termination date and clause in it, or renewal date, is a very stark example that the bank had actually lost sight of some of the key terms in the contract, let alone what they'd originally hoped the system might do for them. Contracts should reflect the business needs of the bank, so they need to be consciously and transparently linked back to the business objectives that the bank has. And as those business objectives change, so the impact on the contract should also be examined going forwards. And finally, we think contracts should have flexibility built in. We think that all parties to the contract need to have a good business outcome, the vendors included. In fact, in some ways, the vendors as much as the bank, and that the contract should allow for real-world changes and events to be responded to whilst ensuring deliverable and sustainable business outcomes for all of the parties. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm in the position of being able to see how many attendees there are, so I can see that you're still here and hopefully still listening. What I would like to stress is that, in fact, there's a recording of this webinar, which is available on the IBS site, and this webinar is a very brief introduction to a much more in-depth training course, which can be delivered in various ways. What I'd like to do now is to pass control back to Martin for his closing comments. So thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you very much indeed, Nick. Thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you in particular to the attendee who sent us a note on the chat facility on this webcast to apologise for being late because he'd been in an escalation meeting with his vendor. Probably him more than anybody else on this call has probably got contract negotiations to mind at this moment. As Nick just mentioned there's only so much we can cover in half hour. Hopefully this has been a valuable insight, but with IBS's knowledge and negotiators' knowledge, we've pulled that together, and we are now offering a training course on this area. We'd be delighted to provide information about this, and so if that is of interest, do please get in contact with us. We also obviously offer wider consultancy, and this is a key area within the consultancy offerings now of IBS, again with our partners and friends negotiators. So we would be very happy to talk to you within a wider context of a system selection, and of course this topic is important for a core selection, but clearly also where contracts are being negotiated for renewal as well, where it is definitely worth reviewing the extent to which the contracts match all the good things that Nick has talked about on this webcast. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much again to everybody for attending. Thank you to Nick, and do please come back to us with any questions that you have, either via the Q&A panel, which will still be available for a bit longer, or else contact us directly. And with that, I'll hand back to Yael.
Thank you, Martin. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our session for today. You may now disconnect. You can simply click on File and then Leave Event, or you can close your web browser and you will be disconnected from the session. Once again, thanks a lot for your participation today. Have a good day.